Am I on? Thank you, and thank you to all the people who are standing up back there. Thank you. Well, it's such a thrill to be back at Highland Park Methodist. I've spent a lot of time here, and it's like coming home. I was really touched to see the photo of Granddaddy Gish up there working in the clothes bank. I didn't tell you, but my sons used to come up to help him work in the clothes bank and didn't tell me until several decades later that what they did was they would go look in all the pockets for money. So I'm glad they waited. Well, golly, I'm looking out at the audience. I'm going to take you back on a time trip to the 1960s. I mean, it's just a guess, but I'm guessing some of you remember the 60s? Okay. Let's talk about the King of Diamonds. I could make a pretty good case that the King of Diamonds was probably the best jewel thief in U.S. history, not just because of the duration of the burglaries for more than 15 years, and not because of the amount of money, probably in today's dollars, about $6 million. Those are all important. And not because it was unique, because it involved a very concentrated area, Highland Park and what's called Old Preston Hollow. Highland Park is just 2.24 square miles. And Preston Hollow is, I think, over 5 square miles, but he was mostly active in about 1 square mile. So it's very unique for a burglar to have been active in that concentrated an area and not get caught. And so all those things are important, but what made him different, what made him the best, was that he was a very distinctive, different, some said peculiar burglar. So let's go back to that time and follow the trail of the King of Diamonds. As you may remember, the 60s were an era of great change. It was a very unique time. I mean, we went from Mamie Eisenhower to Janis Joplin. Sputnik had launched while our rockets were blowing up, but by the end of his career, the King of Diamonds' career, we had a man on the moon. The microchip was discovered right here in Dallas. The Beatles came and went. The King of Diamonds lasted longer than the Beatles. You can believe that. And it was a dramatic era. We had civil rights marches, women's rights marches, in the war marches. So it was a very, very tumultuous time. And the King of Diamonds, I went back. I'll get the hang of it. So he was an odd constant in this world of change. Had a longer run than most presidents in Broadway shows. I often ask myself as I research this, could this have happened anywhere else but Dallas? And I decided no. It could have only happened in Dallas at this time. Why Dallas? Because that's where the money was. After the discovery of Spindletop in 1901, of course, oil boomed and Texas boomed, and Dallas in particular boomed, partly because of the vast size of the East Texas oil field. I mean, look at that. Then after that, you have the oil field in Wichita Falls and what I would call Northwest Texas, and then the discoveries in West Texas. So Dallas was right in the center of the action, and so Dallas prospered. Dallas had smart bankers and prospered, and Texas and Dallas became known for its oil wells, its Cadillacs, and its bragging. I just wanted to show you this slide. Some of you have probably seen it. This is what Dallas looked in 1950. The view from downtown, surrounded by cotton fields. Half of the world's cotton was produced right here in Texas. So Dallas starts prospering in the 50s. This is what Dallas looked like in 1959 as the King of Diamonds was discovered. See the flying red horse? Okay, here's Dallas today. Do you see the flying red horse? A lot of change. But back then, the population was just around 670,000, so Dallas was actually more like Des Moines than New York or San Francisco, which is what Dallas aspired to. And most people weren't rich, but there was this veneer of wealth that drew attention. They were just like sparklers on a cake. So these flamboyant rich, as you will see, were just a slice of Dallas, but they became a big part of the city's mythology. To show this is the New Yorker, has a cartoon of a little shack oil discovered in the backyard. If you can't read it, the caption is the woman on the phone is saying, Neiman Marcus, quick. So along comes all this wealth, and people wanted to look rich. They wanted to celebrate their wealth. So they went to Neiman Marcus, I don't think that the King of Diamonds could have happened if Stanley Marcus had not been in Dallas and helped Dallas develop a reputation for wealth and glamour. He brought Coco Chanel to Dallas with his fashion awards, brought Grace Kelly. Look at the guy peeking at Grace Kelly. I just love that look on his face. Some of you remember the fortnights. Remember the famous fortnights at Neiman Marcus, and celebrities and artists and musicians from all over the world came to Dallas and spurred foreign interest in Dallas and Dallas interest in foreign places. Christmas book, what do you give to people who have everything? You look in the Christmas book where you could get martini-flavored toothpaste. One woman in Fort Worth bought a camel from the Christmas book and still has it, I am told. So Dallas developed this reputation when Delta Airlines in the 1960s did a series of art posters to publicize their destination. Of course, for New York, they had the Empire State Building. For San Francisco, they had the Golden Gate Bridge. What did they have for Dallas? A beautiful woman in jewels. So that was what Dallas was known for. Town and Country magazine in 1953 did a special section on Dallas and the debut of the Crystal Charity Ball, which became the most famous, successful ball in Dallas. And I will say it does look glamorous, doesn't it? Here are some of the people at the ball. On the left picture, you see Greer Garson, the movie actress, seated behind her, Evelyn Lambert, and next to Evelyn, Nancy Hammond, who became famous as a party hostess in Dallas. In the middle, you have handsome Jim Kirksmith, and the woman bending over is the wife of an oil man. In the right corner, you have Nancy Ann Smith, who founded the Crystal Charity Ball, and she's with Dan Daly, the dancer and actor. I will say 3 of the people in these pictures became suspects in the King of Diamonds case, but I'm going to change it so you can't look at it too much. This is Jake Hammond, oil man, and Nancy Hammond, his wife, and she was the hostess with the mostest who hosted these elaborate costume party balls. You think you've been to costume party balls at Halloween. She was the ne plus ultra. She did this before it was chic. Here's some of the people at one of the balls: Sharon and Pollard Simons, Nancy Ann Smith, dolled up. A rare picture of H.L. Hunt at one of Nancy Hammond's parties. He wasn't always invited to parties, but here he is with his son-in-law and his daughter, Margaret, who became one of the King of Diamonds victims. And here's Nancy Hammond. I mean, is this glamour? I mean, do you look like that on weekends? Okay. I love the expression on the chauffeur's face in this one. He said, what are these people doing? But that's Nancy Hammond. These pictures are from photos are from the Hammond collection at SMU. They were really helpful and wonderful to me. So everybody started saying this was so glamorous, so unique, that here they had a jewel thief on the Riviera in the movie that came out at about this same time. And as Dana quoted, I never stole from anybody who would go hungry. And it's true, these people weren't going to miss a meal, but they did lose a lot of jewels. What really put the King of Diamonds on the map was the burglary in 1959 at the house of Josephine Herbert Graf on Park Lane. Beautiful home designed by Edward Durrell Stone, who also designed the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Kennedy Center in Washington. She had lived in Fort Worth, then her husband was killed in World War II. She remarried and moved to Dallas and commissioned this very different, very modern house. Here it is at night. It's just beautiful at night. And that's the view from the back today. Now, some of these photos are from today. They're fairly recent photos, but they give you an idea of how glamorous, you hear mid-century modern. This was it. This was mid-century modern. This is in their bedroom. Wonderful bathroom. And there are houses with wonderful bathrooms today, but I can tell you back then it was very different. And this is the shoe closet of your dreams. What was also distinctive about the Graf house was they had an indoor swimming pool. Now, most people didn't even have swimming pools. They had an indoor swimming pool. And Texas had just come out of a 7-year drought. Some of you may remember that. I remember the drought where the average rainfall in Texas was 15 inches a year. During the drought, they had 7 inches in 7 years. So that's 1 inch a year. And that's when a lot of the rural population moved to the big cities. So water was a luxury. Having an indoor swimming pool was really liquid luxury. They also had a floating dining table that became famous. Edward Drellstone designed this dining table. It looks like it's floating on a slab of marble. And there were many stories about people who came to dinner at the Graf house and literally fell in the drink. One fell in his tuxedo and had to borrow a tuxedo from the waiter to finish the meal. So here's Bruno and Josephine Graf on the night that became so infamous. They were on their way to Fort Worth to the Jewel Ball. Have any of you ever been to the Jewel Ball? More of a Fort Worth thing. Well, the point of the Jewel Ball was jewels. You wore your best jewels. The big jewelers from New York, Cartier, Van Cleef and Arpels, came in. Harry Winston brought their very best jewels, and you could be photographed with their jewels on. They would put you up on a pedestal and take a picture of it, and people could come and admire you. If your husband had enough to drink, you might be lucky to take some home with you. Well, they went to the ball in Fort Worth. They took Alger Meadows and his wife with them in their silver Rolls Royce and didn't get back till about 3 a.m. There was a lot of drinking back then. They stayed for the after party and the after party and the after party. Got home at 3. She was tired. And she took off her jewels and put them on her dresser. Diamond earrings, diamond necklace, diamond bracelet, diamond pin, and a 20.4 carat diamond ring. People said it was a diamond as big as the Alamo. So she takes off her jewelry and she goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, gets up late, starts to get dressed, and she looks, all her jewels are gone. Someone had climbed the wall around the house. It's a 10-foot wall. I actually went and tested it. I'm 5 feet tall, so it was twice as tall as I am. Someone climbed that wall, ran along the top, and leaped over 10 feet to the ledge around the house on the second floor, jimmied open a window, and went in, walked right by their beds while they were sleeping, got the jewels, and walked right back out. They didn't hear a thing. So, of course, they called the police. When they came, realized this was not like any burglary they'd ever seen. There were no fingerprints. They couldn't decide if he was already in the house when they came home or he came in as they were sleeping, but they did leave some telltale footprints on top of the wall that were waffle-shaped. They had ripple soles, and that was the only clue they had. It was the biggest jewel theft in Dallas history, so it made headlines all over the world. There was a lot going on, but this made headlines all over the world. Fannin put his entire burglary department on the case, 50 detectives. They quizzed at times, they checked the airport passenger list, the hotels, the pawn shops, their street sources. They turned Dallas upside down, and what did they get? Nothing. Nothing. And the burglaries continued. Their records, police records were destroyed after some time, and FBI records were destroyed after just a couple of years. So I had to piece things together from the records I could find and people that I talked to. But the police discovered the burglaries that actually started earlier than this, probably 1954, 55, and moved on at a steady clip. So here's the Graf burglary to show you. More burglaries. Still more burglaries. More burglaries. And more. And more. Still more. Yep, more. In Fort Worth. Well, big oil families in Fort Worth. So in Dallas, there were two streets that were hit the heaviest. Park Lane, which was sort of the Loire Valley of Dallas, and maybe 7 on Gaywood, which is a short little street. That's a lot of. Whereas the police had never patrolled in this area before. Most of the crime that they went out on calls was in poorer areas of the city, and so they had to hand draw a map to send the policemen out to patrol. This is Preston Hollow, and I color-coded where some of the burglaries were. You can see he cherry-picked Preston Hollow. Fannin had men out there every night for weeks, driving all night long, up and down. Sometimes they drove 100 miles a night looking for anything. One of them told me, he said, we didn't know what we were looking for. A guy jumping out of a window, a guy walking down the street with a bag of jewels. They had no idea even what they were looking for, but they were out there. The next burglary that really captured attention was in 61, Clint Murkison Sr. Most people didn't know who Josephine Herbert Graf was, but they sure knew who Clint Murkison Sr. was because he'd been on the cover of Time. He was one of the richest men in the country. He was probably number 3 or 4 behind H.L. Hunt and Sid Richardson, other oil men. But looking at his case led me to a different area, a part of Dallas I really didn't know that much about, was that gambling. All these oil men, like Murkison, they all gambled because, oil people are kind of gamblers at heart. They're betting they're going to find a well. And so there was a lot of gambling at that time, as you will see. And this opened up a whole new avenue in the case, trying to paint a portrait of the people and the culture. The Texas Centennial, Benny Bennett, they had gambling trucks. There was a racing parlor downtown. There were 27 casinos downtown, if you can imagine that, during World War II. So our boys who were serving when they were on leave would have something to do downtown. You could go to the Dallas Athletic Club for lunch and order lunch, and they could give you a racing sheet, and you could place a bet and have your results by the end of your lunch. So there was an awful lot of gambling. There were, I'm told, slot machines almost everywhere. The country clubs during hard times, the slot machine income tided them through. There was even a place that I had not heard of before, and I lived in Dallas for over 40 years. I thought I'd been everywhere, seen everything, heard everything. How many of you were familiar with the Top of the Hill Terrace? Oh, wow, yeah. You naughty people. This is Top of the Hill Terrace in Arlington. There was a plumber in Fort Worth named Fred Browning who gambled on the side, was making more money gambling than plumbing. And so he bought a house in Arlington. Arlington was unincorporated, called Top of the Hill Terrace. It had been a tea room. And he moved the house off of its foundation and constructed a 1.5-story casino under it, and then moved the house back. And so underneath there was a casino with chandeliers, with roulette wheels, gaming tables, waiters in tuxedos. And if the police came or the Texas Rangers, which they didn't for a long time, you could escape through tunnels. There was a vast network of tunnels under the top of the hill. So you could go there and have a great dinner, steak Diane, but if you knew what you knew or needed to know, you could go downstairs and gamble. So here's Fred Browning. He thought big. He had a heated swimming pool, a boxing room, and of course a brothel in back. One thing I found was that prostitution went along with the gambling and the crime. They went hand in hand, and of course organized crime was involved in both of those. But look who came to play at Top of the Hill from all over the country. We don't see this many movie stars now. But back then, they came to Top of the Hill. Jean Harlow, Howard Hughes came in tennis shoes with his tux. Just a whole long glamour list of famous people. They had big bands. Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey played out on the balcony, and you could hear the music in Fort Worth. Uh, and of course, the oil men came. All the big oil men came because they had the most money. This was their playhouse. Amon Carter from the Fort Worth Star Telegram came a lot, and he promised them that if the police ever came, not to worry, he wouldn't print the names of the people who were arrested. But look who else came. Bonnie and Clyde, the Galveston mob leader, the mafia dons from Dallas and New Orleans. Bugsy Siegel checked it out. Jack Ruby from Dallas. Louis McWillie, a career gambler, gangster. Benny Binion owned 25% of Top of the Hill. And when Browning got into financial trouble, Sid Richardson became a silent partner. And when Browning got ill and Benny Binion left town, Sid Richardson inherited Top of the Hill, and so what did he do? He sold it to his insurance company, who gave it to now, I'm sure Walt would agree the Lord works in mysterious ways. You can go there today and get a tour of the tunnels. Now, people like to glamorize Benny Binion, or some do, like he was this character, but he was a gangster, make no mistakes about it. He killed several people, had people killed, poked a guy's eye out with a pencil. He was a rough guy, but he gambled with the sheriff, which sort of says things in a nutshell. He produced a whole class. It was Top of the Hill was a prep school for gamblers and for criminals. This is Benny Bickers, a gambler. This is Mickey Mantle. Some of you may recognize him. The sports stars also went to places like Top of the Hill. Clint Murkison liked the race the ponies so much and bet on that he bought a racetrack in California on the coast near La Jolla, the Del Mar racetrack. And so, of course, all the oil men and all the beautiful people of Dallas and Hollywood went there too. He had a hotel where people came to go to gamble at the Del Mar. And around the pool, you would find lots of celebrities. Once again, there's always an attraction between famous people and money, and vice versa. And of course, these oil men had friends in high places, provided them with campaign donations and comped them at all their events because they wanted the politicians to keep the depletion allowance. And so there was a synergy between the oil people and between Dallas and politics in Washington that gambling reinforced. People in Dallas also went to Cuba. The oil people went first looking for oil, discovered the floor shows and the gambling. I just put this in to wake up the people in back. You guys okay up there? All right. This became important to me. You're thinking, well, what does this have to do? Well, one of the main suspects in King of Diamonds had worked at one of the casinos, San Souci, that was owned by Santo Trafficante, the mob boss in Florida. So you begin to see how a matrix is beginning to form between gambling and money and Dallas and various places, Cuba and Las Vegas. So one of the suspects came to Dallas after that, brought her voodoo dancers to the state fair. They were a big hit, a lot bigger hit than the 4-H exhibits. People in Dallas also went to New Orleans to the Beverly Country Club, which was a very glamorous restaurant with gambling that was run by Carlos Marcello, the mob boss in New Orleans. So this matrix is beginning to fill in. Now, I was always told we didn't have organized crime in Dallas. The truth is we did. It was different. It was smaller. You didn't have to pay a bribe to get your building permit, but it was there. This guy on the left, Joe Savella, was the mob boss in Dallas. He was busted in the 1930s by federal authorities with $300,000 worth of heroin. So that was, as they say, a lot of cheddar in those days. He was the mob boss in Dallas during the whole reign, the King of Diamonds reign. And when he died in 1970, supposedly, Joe Campisi became the La Cosa Nostra boss in Dallas, which he always sort of denied, played it both ways, had pictures up in the restaurant, but laughed about it. Oh, no, I couldn't do that. But federal authorities told me the phone records showed he talked to Carlos Marcelo 20 times a week. He sent him notes in Leavenworth, had private birthday parties for him, sent him sausage, played golf with his sons, attended the wedding of his son, and when Campisi died, Marcelo paid for his funeral. So you can make your own conclusion there. Um, this is Campisi with one of Marcelo's sons. But he was Mr. Congeniality. People loved Campisi's. They still have the best pizza in Dallas, I think. People went there, they liked Joe's. I think, oh no, not Joe, no, he couldn't. What interested me was less whether he was or wasn't, or maybe, were the people who hung out there. It was like a club for criminals. The guy on the left is a hitman named R.D. Matthews, Russell Douglas Matthews, who killed dozens of people, probably. He was a hitman for Carlos Marcelo and Santo Trafficante. You notice some familiar names come up. I couldn't include this picture in the book because it was so poor quality, there weren't enough pixels, as they say, but I mean, you would never mistake him for a Highland Park minister, would you? No. The guy on the right was equally tough, James Henry Dolan, who also did hit jobs for Santo Trafficante. And interestingly enough, what was also important to me, they both stole jewels. They had a smelter in their garage to melt some of the gold down. So there were a lot of people stealing jewels in Dallas, which made it difficult. There were actually multiple layers of crime in Dallas besides the Cosa Nostra. You also had the Dixie Mafia, which were Southern thugs, loosely organized but very dangerous, who also stole jewels. The guy on the left, and I mean, is he pretty? This is Kirksey McCord Nix, who stole jewels, did burglaries, did hijackings, killed people, killed judges, was a hitman himself. Paul McCarran, the lead cop on the King of Diamonds case, captured him and arrested him at a Dallas motel. He not only captured him, he, as they say, beat the crap out of him and threw him down the stairs. So Kirksey McCord Nix put a contract out on a bounty on McCarran's head for $50,000. So Paul McCarran was so cheeky, he had his lawyer call him and say, couldn't he have made it $100,000? But when he went to the pen, he was replaced by Stanley the Creeper Cook, who was called the Creeper because he liked to follow behind his victims before he killed them. It's a nice thought when you're out in the dark sometime. He not only smuggled cocaine, they caught him with a lot of cocaine, but yes, he stole jewels. So meanwhile, the beautiful people were hanging out at the Sapango Club. Now, how many people went to the Sapango Club? I actually did. A lot. It was pretty cool, wasn't it? Yeah, it was very cool. In a mansion over on Turtle Creek. This was where high society liked to party. There's oilman Buddy Fogelson, Greer Garson's husband, and oilman Dick Andrade on the right. See the lady in the black hat? The man next to her is Earl Dalton, who supposedly was the manager at the Sapango. Biddy Binion probably owned it, but he came from the Biddy Binion Graduate School of Gambling from top of the hill. So you're seeing how all these things interact. At the Sapango, once again, lots of Hollywood stars came, sports stars. Clint Merckson Jr. supposedly got the idea for the Cowboys in the bar. Louis McWillie, who had been at Top of the Hill and at the Four Deuces in Fort Worth, went from there to the Caribbean, went from there to Cuba, went from there to Las Vegas, and he was always in a car with what they call a torpedo, a bodyguard. He was upstairs at the Sapango. So if you went to Sapango, it's an interesting thought. Problem with all this, with gambling, now people like to gamble. Look at the Texas lottery. People have gambled for all time. As one U.S. attorney explained to me, gambling provided the criminal nest for wrongdoing, not just in Dallas, but around the country. It went hand in hand with liquor smuggling, prostitution, theft, and burglary. So gambling was the cash cow for organized crime. And in the 60s, while the King of Diamonds was at work, more than $10 million a week was being wagered in Dallas, which is a lot. And of course, guess who controlled the Southwest racing wire that people placed their bets through and got their information? Carlos Marcelo. Paul McCarran ended up trying to warn people about organized crime, but local leaders tended to turn a deaf ear to it. All this became important to me because three of the lead suspects in the King of Diamonds were gamblers and at one point had owned a casino in Las Vegas, their own casino called the El Cortez, which is the oldest continuously operating casino in Las Vegas. It's still in business today. They sold it to Bugsy Siegel, bought a nightclub in LA, Sunset Strip. When that went under, they came to Dallas looking for debutantes and ready money. Another factor that emerged because of this relationship between the gambling and between the clubs and between the prostitution were the strip clubs downtown across the street from Neiman Marcus. Famous strippers like Candy Bar, who performed at stag clubs for rich businessmen. Jada in the middle came to the carousel from Carlos Marcello's club in New Orleans. Jack Ruby became a figure in the case because he was involved not just in the prostitution, but in the gambling. So meanwhile, while all this seamy stuff was going on, you can imagine, this was like looking for a jewel thief in Casablanca. I never thought this would be what I would find in Dallas, but as you can tell from these headlines, I mean, it's not every day you have the headline, "Diabolical Gem Thief on the Loose." But we did. Police were still looking for the King of Diamonds while all this was going on, trying everything they could, and a pattern developed. He did leave these overshoe tracks. He only took women's jewelry. He often left items behind. At Clint Murkison's house, he took over $100,000 worth of wonderful, expensive jewels, but he left behind $200,000 worth of wonderful, expensive jewels. So in today's dollars, that would be in millions. And police were totally floored. What kind of thief picks gems like chocolates in a box? Just takes the ones he wants. Most thieves just scoop them all into a sack and take them and go. He was very picky thief. He went to one house and didn't take anything. The people were so embarrassed. You can imagine. But what was very unusual is he came while people were there, having a party or having dinner downstairs or watching TV or asleep in their beds. That had just not happened before. This was a town where you could leave your door unlocked. You could leave your car keys on your car seat. It never occurred to somebody that somebody would come in and take their belongings while they were sitting there or sleeping there nearby. He was very athletic. He could scale those high walls. He climbed trees. He jumped long distances, climbed on the roof. In a case, he reached through windows in one, grabbed jewels out of a jewel box, swung on a light fixture, somersaulted out the window, and escaped by going down the creek. They had never seen anybody like this, I can tell you that for sure. People figured out as this went on for long, it had to be one of them. It was one of them, robbing people he knew. And they figured out it probably followed the debutante schedule because it went from October to January or March, the social season when all the big balls and the dead balls were held because women had their jewels out of a safe if they kept them at the bank and in their house somewhere. The press figured this out too. They were a little slow. One of the debutantes, Margaret Otis, wanted to help. Police wanted to come and observe at one of the Deb balls. They, of course, had never been to a Deb ball, and so Margaret Otis paid to rent tuxes for the police to come. It was a total disaster because they didn't know anybody there. The people there didn't know him and came over to him and asked him to get him a drink. And nobody told him not to wear brown shoes. So here we go. Everyone in the town is baffled, and everyone suspected everybody else. The changing times in Dallas were reflected when one of his big hits was at the home of Jim Ling, the corporate titan from LTV. And as you can see the little arrows, or I hope you can, he climbed up the side of the house like a rock climber, swung onto a balcony, came in and walked down the hall to their bedroom. They were downstairs watching TV at the time. And at the time, there was a security guard with a dog patrolling around the house. Was he good? Yeah. Yeah, he was good. So the police they're still carrying out their dragnet. They polygraphed the servants. They checked out the cleaners, security services, the bankers knew who had the safe deposit boxes, the valeters, the yardmen. I mean, everybody they could, and they still once again got nothing. So this was the guessing game. Have you been hit? In the end, or as it went on, this became the ultimate game of Clue. I think I had not just a few suspects mentioned to me or confided to me. There were hundreds. Everyone suspected everybody else. If it was a room with this many people, people would be saying it's him. And that's what they would do at the big balls and social events. So these are just some of the names that came up that I looked into. 3 handsome brothers, a gambler, George Owen, a socialite, somebody from a prominent family. People thought, well, could it be a hairstylist? Who knew better, right? Who knew when women were getting fluffed up to go out? Fingers were pointed. Was it another socialite, one of Jack Ruby's buddies who sold jewels out of his trunk? Dixie Mafia, Mayor D. Fannin thought that the Dixie Mafia may have pulled some of the cases that the king got credit for. Was it an architect, an Italian sculptor? This was the wildest theory ever, that this Italian sculptor went to people's homes and made busts of them, clay models of busts of them, then he sent them to Europe, and people thought he hid the jewels in the clay bust. That was the most creative theory, and unfortunately it ruined his business, ruined him and his business. Insurance people, landscapers, tennis pro. Could it be a woman? Was the king a queen? The few sightings there were of the king were of a man, but could have been a woman who had an accomplice, a very nimble accomplice. Was it a society writer? This is Ann Draper. She knew all the parties. She went to the parties. But guess what? She was helping the police. They came and sat around our kitchen table and she explained to them what a deb was. She printed fake stories saying that people were going out of town when they weren't so they could guard their house. Was it a jeweler? The king was very discriminating. He only took the best. Even if it was costume jewelry, he only took the best thing. So they had to be a jeweler. So they suspected Dudley Ramsden, who was the head jeweler salesman at Neiman Marcus, but he also was helping the police. He was telling them who had the best jewels and when they were going to the jewel ball in Fort Worth, and he took his jewels to the Fort Worth ball in an armored car. Then in '63, the Kennedy assassination changed everything in the city. The king was no longer on the front page. Fannin and McCarran ended up being promoted up. McCarran was assigned to the Kennedy assassination. The city was in mourning. Dead balls were canceled. The opera was canceled. But the King of Diamonds was not deterred. He hit a house just 2 weeks after the assassination on Beverly Drive, home of an architect. Then he hit Ruth Sharp, who served on the grand jury that indicted Jack Ruby, Chaz Donnelly, Dan Barrell. The burglaries continued. He did not pause. The publicity eased up, but it did not end. So after all this time, police were really stymied. They had interviewed thousands of people. They weren't sitting on their hands. Polygraphed people, had card files. They consulted fortune tellers. They tried night dog goggles. They tried aerial flights. They wiretapped phones, searched luggage, usually without a search warrant, I might add. So people got very anxious. You know, they started getting paranoid about somebody being in their house, and wouldn't you? I want to leave you with these 3 cases just so you can imagine, what if this happened to you? What if this were your house? On the left, you've got Margaret Hunt Hill. She and her husband went to dinner one night, got back about 9 or 10-ish, went up to their bedroom, changed their clothes to get in bed. While they were doing so, somebody climbed up a spiral staircase outside their bedroom, went up to the balcony and sat on the balcony and smoked 3 or 4 cigarettes, just feet away from them. Now, is that brazen? Is that somebody who's self-confident? So when he senses they're asleep, he comes in the sliding door, walks past their beds, goes to the dressing room, takes the drawer with the jewels out, goes down the inside steps to the kitchen, sits at the kitchen table and starts sorting through the jewels, gets thirsty, gets up, gets a glass of water. He had to go to, before he went down the stairs, he had to walk by the bedroom of their teenage daughter who was going to Hockaday. So just place this in your mind that while you're asleep and your daughter's asleep, there's some guy going down the stairs with a drawer full of jewels, and he's in your kitchen. Um, she was considerably alarmed by it, but she was happy. She had a 10-carat diamond ring that he didn't get because it was in one of those little jewelry cleaners. Do you remember with the little stick that you put it in? So at least he didn't get her ring. In the middle, you've got Ruth Sharp's daughter. Her husband had just been on the city council, so they were well known. She was the godmother of philanthropy in Dallas. After her grand jury duties, she was just exhausted, wrung out. Most people were. Such an emotional drain. She said to her husband, "Why don't we go to the Terps of Korean ball, the big finale for the Deb season, because, we need some relief here." So they went, but it was her daughter's first date. She was 15. They told her, "Be home at 10." So she was a good girl. She got home at 10. She came in, turned on the TV. She looked and she noticed her parents' door to their bedroom was closed. And she thought, "Well, that's odd. It's usually open. I wonder if they got back before me." So she watches TV for a little while. She goes to her room, gets undressed, gets in bed. Her parents came in later, got up the next morning and discovered while her daughter was sitting there watching TV, the king was in their bedroom. So imagine leaving your children at that vulnerable age at home. On the right, you've got Barbara Burrell. She and her husband went to dinner at the penthouse of Evan Lambert at 3525. It dragged on. There's a lot of arts people talking art, so it dragged on, lasted late. They got home about midnight. And she was concerned and tired because they were flying to Paris the next morning. Her husband had invented a drill bit and had a company in France. They were going to Paris early the next morning. So she walked in. She felt something was amiss. And this was often the case. Women intuited something wasn't right. And she thought she heard a click as she's going up the stairs. So she calls down to her husband. She says, "Honey, have you locked up?" And he said, "Yeah, I am right now. Why?" And she said, "Oh, nothing. I just thought I heard a sound." So she goes into their bedroom. The sound sounded like it came from her bedroom, from the closet. So she looked at her closet. The door was open. So she went over, looked in, shut the closet door. Gets undressed, goes to bed, sleeps fitfully, gets up the next morning, and the first thing she sees is her closet door is wide open. He was in the closet. When I interviewed her, it was 50 years later, but her voice broke and she was very emotional. Still, 50 years later, she said, "Just think, he was there while I was standing there without my clothes on and then in my nightgown, in my bed." You could tell she still hadn't gotten over it. One of the interesting, intriguing things about her case was when she checked after she noticed the closet door, she noticed that her bag that she was taking to Paris was gone and her jewels with it, and some from her dresser. But one thing that stood out was that they had 3 yappy dogs who always barked at everybody. You know what I mean when I say a yappy dog? The dogs didn't bark, and that happened in case after case. Sometimes people's dogs were on the bed with them, and he would walk right by their bed, and the dog didn't bark. Why didn't the dogs bark? The whole thing, as one debutante said, was very peculiar. So you can imagine while people were ill at ease. The University Park Police Chief put out a reward with his own money for $1,000 for what he described as Dallas's most wanted criminal, the master jewel thief. So the police kept looking for him, but the burglary stopped. In 1970, so the burglaries eventually stopped, but the great mystery is who was the King of Diamonds? Who pulled off? Who was the best jewel thief in the United States? Maybe He was right next door all that time. So thank you. I should add, for only $28, you can find out. You can find out tonight. So I'll take a few questions. Richard, is that okay? By the way, I should have said at the beginning, thank you to Richard Stanford. Thank you to Walt Markham. Thank you to Dana. Thank you to the Rejebians. Thank you. Great question. Um, yes to everything. The police, Paul McCarran, and they did a smart thing. They got a psychologist to do a psychological profile of the king, and he estimated that it was a man in his early 30s who was athletic, from a affluent family, may have gone to SMU, athletic, nimble, but not a contact sport, and that he had a mama fixation because he only took women's jewels. And so the psychologist hypothesized that it was like a fetish that he kept the jewels. And Paul McCarran thought that too. And he said at our very first lunch at an Italian restaurant, of course, he hypothesized that he still had them, that he kept them. But there's also the possibility of pawn shops. I have a whole chapter on pawn shops because one of the suspects was very good friends with the pawn shop owner who also gambled and was friends with Benny Binion. And so there was a connection between the pawn shops. Oh, sure. No, that doesn't ring a bell. There were a lot of names that came up and still come up. Uh, I get a lot of emails from people saying, well, everybody thought it was so and so, and usually they didn't have the access or they weren't the right age. So you kind of go through a process of winnowing them down. But no, I don't think so in the Hardin case. Yeah. Oh, there's a lady over here, but yes. Hi. No. Maybe some jewels that showed up in an LA case, but it was hard to determine whether they were King of Diamonds jewels. You know, back then they didn't mark jewels. They didn't have lasers. They didn't have computers. They didn't keep ID lists. So it was really easy for unmarked jewels to disappear and very hard to identify them. No, thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How he did that? Yeah, it was somebody who probably had access to the homes through parties and social circles and dinners. And he also did a lot of homework. Um, there was one house, the B House, in Preston Hollow. He worked for Clint Murkison. He and his wife went out, came back, went to sleep. And their case was traumatizing too because they had a 3-year-old daughter, Jill B, who sleepwalked. And the next morning, when they realized that they had been burgled, they were so alarmed because they thought, what if Jill had gotten out and walked in the night and bumped in, to a criminal? But in that case, he must have surveilled the house because he knew they went out and he knew they didn't have sliding doors. So he had tools with him to take the panes out of the glass on the downstairs floor. So you can't just do that with a screwdriver, as so he had scoped out the house. There were a lot of times he seemed to always know the way out, too. Not just that the women, back then you would have a vanity with a mirror and a drawer. That a lot of women would keep their jewels in there if they didn't have a jewel box on a dresser. If they weren't going out, didn't have them in a safe at the bank. So he knew that. He knew that from probably having sisters, maybe, or going to parties or being in their homes. But he also knew the layout of the home. So he probably had been there or he had researched it. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more. Allison, you get it.
Just wondered, was gambling legal during that time? Because clearly.
It mostly was. And Will Wilson had waged this campaign. Pardon me? Oh, had waged a campaign against crime and shut down a lot of it, but it just went underground. Today, we hear a lot about how much of gambling is being legalized. Um, Legal gambling is at an all-time high, billions and billions of games wagered on bets wagered on sports games and other things, but illegal gambling is also higher than ever before because you don't have to pay taxes on it. So some types were, some weren't. Some states, horse racing was legal. Some states in Texas it wasn't for a while. So yes and no, I guess would be the answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you, Rena.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody.